Hello and welcome to Food Systems, a podcast from the Forum for the Future of Agriculture, where we discuss ideas that can shape a sustainable food system, from farm to fork, from policy to consumers, and everything in between. I'm your host, Robert de Graaf, and you can find us on Twitter at Forum for Ag. These episodes will be available every other week on all major podcast platforms. Before we get started, we would like to say a quick thank you to the FFA founding partners, the European Landowners Organization and Syngenta, as well as the FFA strategic partners, Cargill, the Nature Conservancy, Thought for Food, and the World Wildlife Fund. Please enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome back to Food Systems. We're in the run-up now to the UN Food Systems Summit, and today I'm very pleased to be joined by Emile Frison. He is one of the panel members of the panel of experts on sustainable food systems, IPES FOOD, and he is also the Food Systems Summit co-leader on the solution cluster on agroecology and regenerative agriculture. Emile, thank you so much for joining Food Systems today.
You're welcome.
As you understand it, what is the goal of the UN Food Systems Summit and what do you hope that it will achieve?
Well, I think there was a realization that our food systems are broken or are not functioning the way they should, and that it's urgent to address this issue, both from a food security and nutrition point of view, from a climate, both mitigation and adaptation point of view, from an environmental point of view, as well as biodiversity conservation. And therefore, I think people realize that we must try to fix this. What I hope to get out of it, it's still difficult to say. I think the organization of the summit has been somewhat atypical and maybe not really organized in a very planned way, and therefore it's still very difficult to see what will come out of it. What I would personally hope would come out of it is a clear realization that we need a radical change in our food systems, that we need to change the paradigm in which we are functioning from essentially a productivist approach towards a sustainable food systems approach that takes a systems approach and that cares about sustainability as an extremely important objective, and that there is a resolution to do something about it and not just have a declaration. So that's what I would hope would come out of it. Whether that will materialize or not is another question.
So in 2017, you co-authored an article in The Guardian as well as a larger report that already stated that the world must move away from what you termed industrial farming towards a more diversified agroecological set of practices. We have now 4 years later. Is agriculture different now since that report you've done, or are we still in the same systems that we were then?
Okay. Well, that article in The Guardian was based on a report that IPES FOOD published in 2016, and of which I was the lead author, advocating for a paradigm shift away from industrial agriculture towards diversified agroecological systems. And I think a lot of things have changed since 2016 or 2017. There is now an increasing number of applications of these diversified agroecological systems in different parts of the world, in different continents, several really at scale. So it's no longer that there is some anecdotal evidence. There is solid evidence now that has been accumulated over the years. In addition, there is really the realization by a number of major reports, such as the recent IPCC reports on climate, the IPBES reports on biodiversity, the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition, and all of them recognize that there is a need for a paradigm shift, that incremental improvements of our current industrial system are not going to be sufficient to address the problems. and that is now reflected on the ground. Not as much, by far not, as I would have liked to see, because there are quite a number of obstacles that make it difficult. But that's another question. But I think things have really moved, not as fast as I would like.
Well, let's talk a bit about the speed of change, because I think this is a really interesting aspect. Certainly, if we compare it to climate change, some of the major signs that the Earth was heating was already published in the 1980s. We've had a series of updated IPCC reports afterwards, but the speed of change has certainly not been what you or I would have wished. I mean, we are still on track for massive global heating. What sort of timeline should we now really be looking at if we want to transform our agricultural systems? Are we talking decades, years?
Definitely not decades. I think there is a pretty well or broad recognition now that we have something like 10 harvests left. And if we don't get our system really fixed, we will be in deep trouble. Not only because of the negative impact on the environment, etc., but just to feed the world. And therefore, we really have to move quickly. And I'm a born optimist, so I think that we will be moving faster than on the climate. Indeed, it's taken 40 or so years, or 50 years almost, since the first alarm bells went out for climate. It cannot wait that long for food system transformation, and I think people realize that. And I think the fact that we are now seeing countries really making major decisions. Just 2 weeks ago, the president of Sri Lanka has announced that they have decided to convert Sri Lankan agriculture to agroecology and to ban imports of pesticides and synthetic fertilizers to make sure that this happens quickly. So I think that's a major shift. The state of Sikkim in India is already 100% organic. In Andhra Pradesh, we have 700,000 farmers that have converted to agroecology. And the ambition is that by 2026, 100% of the Andhra Pradesh farmers be on agroecology, what they call natural farming in Andhra Pradesh. So I think things are moving faster, but still, that is by far not sufficient. There is still a lot of resistance, and we must continue to convey the message that there's no time to be lost.
So let's go back a little bit to the UN Food System Summit then, which is really meant to catalyze a lot of these developments. I was looking specifically into track 3 on nature positive production. I found it to be very broad. The design elements include diversity, co-creation, synergy, efficiency, recycling, resilience, social values, food tradition, governance, and circular economy. Now, while all these are very important, and I wouldn't wish to denigrate any of them, but I did get the feeling that this is an extraordinary broad set. Is it not too broad to create a movement for real practical change?
Absolutely not. I mean, that's the real point, and I wish that those elements were taken more seriously in the Food System Summit. By the way, these elements that you have cited are the 10 elements of agroecology that were adopted by FAO a few years ago. Although the Food System Summit document doesn't acknowledge that, they just quote the text without referring to the origin of the text. And this was, I think, one of the major mistakes that was made in the Food System Summit setup. They started. It's a food system summit, i.e., we have to take a systemic approach. And one of the reasons why we are in the deep trouble we are in now is because things have been handled in silos in the past. Agriculture wanted to maximize productivity, the environment wanted to protect the environment, health wanted to fix the health problems once they are created, and so on and so on. And what we need is really a systemic approach that looks at all those things at the same time in an integrated way, in order to continue to avoid these contradictions in policies, where policies set by the Ministry of Agriculture are in complete contradiction to what environment would want to see or health would want to see, etc. So I think the what should really happen is this systemic approach, and I think the 10 elements are describing the various areas that have to be part of the thinking. And that's what we are in the solution cluster on agroecology and regenerative agriculture. That's what we are advocating for, that we look at transforming food systems based on these 10 elements. And actually, we are using the 13 principles that were in the high-level panel of experts report of 2019 on agroecology, agroecological and other innovative approaches, where the 10 elements have been translated into more operational principles, because the 10 elements are a bit too vague and can also be interpreted in different ways. So the 13 principles cover the same ground than the 10 elements, but are more specific and are more intended to be guiding principles for food system transformation. And that's essentially what the solution cluster on agroecology and regenerative agriculture is advocating to the Food System Summit as a whole. So the problem with the Food Systems Summit so far has been they started by dividing it in 5 action tracks. One on nutrition, one on the environment, one on production, etc., etc. And I think that was already a mistake. And then within that, in action track 3, it's divided into protect, manage, and restore, the 3 action areas. And then within that, they've clustered a number of solutions. There were 2,200 proposed game-changing solutions. I mean, honestly, what can you do with 2,200 recommendations? Nothing. So even clustering them, and in, as I said, the solution cluster on agroecology and regenerative agriculture is the one that received the largest number of propositions, which is really showing the great interest for that. But even that, it was too nitty gritty. And so what we decided in the managing this solution cluster was to really advocate for the application of the 13 principles to food system transformation for the summit as a whole. So we don't want to be just one solution cluster among the 54, as there are now 54 solution clusters on the table for the moment. Some are dealing with things as specific as insects for animal feed, for example. Now, okay, that's a very specific thing. It's a useful thing to think about. But what we are talking about is really transforming the food system in a holistic way and using the 13 principles to guide that.
So maybe this is an interesting point for our listeners, and also personally for me. I've seen a number of different descriptions and definitions of agroecology, and certainly for regenerative agriculture. I was wondering if maybe you could give the definition that works for you on both those terms, just so I think for our listeners it's clear what these actually mean.
I think it's a very important question, because there is a lot of use and abuse of both these terms. And so it is indeed essential to know what we are talking about. And actually, in 2020, IFOAM Organics International, IPES Food, Agroecology Europe, Regeneration International, and Feeble Europe, which is an organic research organization, joined forces to in the organization of a series of 3 workshops where we invited people involved in organic agriculture, in agroecology, in regenerative agriculture from different parts of the world, and see what is it that we think we have in common, what can we all stand for. And out of these 3 workshops, we decided that the 13 principles that I just referred to, 13 principles of agroecology that are described in the HLPE report, that is what we all stand behind. and that anything less than that is greenwashing. So if you're saying, well, I just do conservation agriculture or no-till agriculture and use glyphosate to get rid of the weeds, that's not agroecology. Although some people are using, or regenerative, it's not regenerative agriculture. Although some people are using the term regenerative agriculture for that. So uh, after these 3 workshops, we wanted to see whether there was a broader buy-in, and we had a webinar in November 2020 with more than 700 participants from different parts of the world, and where this proposal was really strongly supported. And we decided to issue a call for food system transformation based on these 13 principles, and stating very clearly this is what organic agriculture, agroecology, regenerative, and for each case, the true organic and true regenerative are standing for. And we want this to be guiding the food system transformation, and we warn against attempts to greenwash and dilute or do cherry picking among these principles, which should certainly not be acceptable. And that call has now been signed by more than 160 organizations worldwide and more than 460 individuals, and it's still running.
Okay, so let's see if we can make this a bit more concrete for our listeners who are mainly in Europe. So I apologize, but I will speak about Europe in this case. Can you sort of paint a picture for our listeners in brief? What does an agroecological, socially and financially sustainable, and let's say arable, let's leave livestock out of it for now, but let's say an arable farm, what does it look
Well, I
like in
think
Europe?
you already make a mistake by saying let's leave the animals out, because really sustainable systems in have to be diversified and have to include animals as well. And one of the big problems we have today is because there's been a dissociation between crop production and livestock production, where we have these industrial livestock systems that are catastrophic from an environmental impact point of view, from a health impact point of view, and etc. And we have systems that are not being sustainable for the crop production because they are also lacking recycling of organic matter, etc. And so, one concrete example maybe is, well, let's take I have a friend in Austria. His name is Alfred Grand, and he has the Grand Farm in one word. You can look it up on the website. It's in Austria. Uh, this is it's not a small thing. It's more than 100 hectares of arable land, but he also is growing vegetables in a kind of a vegetable garden, and he has not been using inorganic fertilizers or pesticides for quite a number of years now. He's making more money now than he used to before he converted to this form of agroecology, organic farming. And he's been able to employ people with decent salaries, etc. So I think there are concrete, and this is just one. It happens that I've been working with Alfred now in the last couple of years, but there are other initiatives like that at all scales. And often you hear that agroecology, yeah, that's fine on a small scale, but it's not replicable or it's not scalable. I think that's just nonsense. There is now enough evidence that it is both scalable and replicable. The thing is that it's not a silver bullet approach. It's and that's why we are not using a set of recipes, but it's guided by these principles that are locally adapted. I mean, what you do on the ground has to be locally adapted, based also on the knowledge of farmers and the people in the local food system, and you marry that with the best of science in order to really address the local problems and bring local solutions to local problems. What is in common is the 13 principles. What is applied on the ground is location specific.
So one of the things that we talk a lot on this podcast with a number of previous guests as well is where should the funding come from to pay for the transition to an agroecological, much more sustainable food system? Who will pay and where is it going to come
a good
from?
starting point is the 720 billion euro that is going into subsidies around the world every year. If that was reallocated towards an agroecological transformation, I think that would actually achieve the kind of transformation we need. So that is certainly the first and most important starting point. In addition, on fisheries, there's another 35 billion of subsidies for that, of which it is estimated between 18 and 20 billion is actually known to be damaging to oceans. So I think we really have to make that transformation in these subsidy systems, and just removing policies that are preventing the transition and the transformation. Sometimes it doesn't really necessarily have to cost more, but it's just a matter of creating a policy environment that is encouraging this form of agriculture rather than a destructive form of agriculture.
Well, let me ask you now the last question of this interview, which is the same we ask of everybody, which is if you could give one single concrete policy or a practical idea to create a more sustainable food system, what would it be?
Well, first of all, it would be to replace the current sectoral policies by a food system policy. Now we have an agricultural policy that contradicts the environmental objectives and the health objectives, etc. If we have a food system policy that integrates all these dimensions, we would be really able to avoid the trade-offs and create synergies between the different policies. And IPES Food issued a report 2 years ago uh, towards a European food policy that has actually been having an influence in the creation of the farm to fork strategy, which has taken quite a bit of its inspiration from this IPES food report, advocating for basically a replacement or an evolution of an agricultural common policy by a European food policy that would bring together the various sectors. And it was advocated that this should be guided by a vice president at the commission level, so that it's not linked to any of the directorates general that are sectorally divided. I think that certainly is one thing that would have the greatest impact and is already being implemented at local level. Not yet at national level, but many cities or regions have started to look at integrated food policies with success.
Emile Frison, panel member of IPES Food and Food System Summit, co-lead on the Solution Cluster for Agroecology and Regenerative Agriculture. Thank you so much for joining Food Systems today.
It was a pleasure.
You've been listening to an episode of Food Systems, a podcast brought to you by the Forum for the Future of Agriculture. Look for us in 2 weeks when we release our new episode. And in the meantime, please don't forget to subscribe on your podcast app as well as on Twitter @ForumFag for updates on this podcast, news, as well as FFA events. Please check out our website www.forumforagriculture.com for more great content. Thank you for listening and enjoy your day.